Hello, welcome to our service today. I hope you'll be blessed by the hymns and prayers and readings and talks that you'll hear today. Our theme today has been based around the parable of the sheep and the goats, found in Matthew 25. I wonder what your reaction is when you read it. Well, I suspect some of you might be thinking, well, perhaps I've turned up for the wrong exam. A bit like children turning up to an examination at school and finding that the exam paper isn't quite what they expected. Because here Jesus focuses on the actions of people as to whether they have helped those in need or not. And people are judged on that basis. What do you think about that? People here are judged by their treatment of the hungry, the thirsty, and those in need of clothing, the sick and the prisoners. Well, Jesus, you might say, that's a bit left field. You never taught, or the pupils at school might end up by saying after the exam to the teacher, you never taught me that. I mean, all this time I thought I was okay, being a Baptist. I've trusted in Jesus, I've said the prayer, I've been baptized. But somehow the rule seems to have changed when you read Matthew 25. I've always thought it was right to put my belief in the right things. Some people call that orthodoxy. I've always placed a great deal of importance on Paul when he talks about being saved by faith. So why in this case is Jesus telling us that there's some things we need to do, some works we need to do? Well, here in this parable, Christ the King judges between sheep and goats and judges them on their actions. And surprisingly or interestingly, the sheep and the goats seem completely unaware of what they had done. Well, to put your mind to rest, you just need to accept Jesus as your Saviour. You need to put your faith and trust in him and be born again. You do. You're not saved by works. But your works, the things you do, should show your change of heart. People should be able to see the difference in you and me. This is the real litmus test. Jesus is really saying, look, it's not just going to church that's going to get you through those pearly gates. I wonder, have you heard the joke about the Baptist deacon and the archbishop? There's no insult intended here, but the Baptist deacon died, sadly. And when he got to the pearly gates, he was met by St. Peter. And it was explained to him that when he was in heaven, everyone in heaven was given a vehicle, something to ride, something to drive, that would suit and be a suitable reward for their life spent on earth. And the Baptist deacon was shown through the pearly gates and shown to this incredibly shiny, brand new Lamborghini, because he was told he was done so many good things in his life, he needed to be rewarded. And so off he drives into heaven in this beautiful car. And a couple of days later, he swerves and crashes and spoils his Lamborghini and has to be taken to the heavenly hospital. And while in there, someone comes to visit him and asks him how it was that he ended up crashing his car. And he says, I was really, really enjoying my Lamborghini, but as I was going along, I was completely taken by surprise when I saw the Archbishop on his bike. Boom. And so no insults intended here. But there's nothing new in what Jesus is saying in this chapter 25. 24 and 25 in Matthew are concerned with the end of times and judgment, and people, there's several illustrations of how people may or may not be rewarded for what they've done. The wise and foolish maidens, the talents, it's all in this bit of the Bible here, and Jesus is warning people of the time that is to come and how they might prepare for it. But it's significant that this parable of the sheep and the goats is the very last real teaching that Jesus gives before Maundy Thursday, before his arrest and before his crucifixion. And some people have realised that links, actually, if you think about it, what was the first thing Jesus taught? It was in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Beatitudes. So if you think about the values and things that Jesus was saying in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Beatitudes, those blessed statements, and then compare them with what Jesus says at the end, because the ones who'd been good were the blessed ones who were going to inherit their kingdom. Think about the values that Jesus was teaching there. In Matthew 5, he talks about meekness, a hunger for righteousness, mercy, a desire for purity, and a desire for peace. So these do seem to have quite a strong connection, because here in Matthew 25, Jesus is saying that he is really concerned about people living their lives and being loving, showing concern and action for inequality and injustice. So maybe it's a big mistake to focus too much on orthodoxy, right belief, making sure the church is right and on the right tracks and not veering off into heresy, making sure the services are nice. Because there's a lot of need around us. And it seems that the parable here in Matthew 25 is pointing us to the desperate need of people around us and how important it is that we should take notice of that and do something about it. Well, let's sort out one or two things. We need to understand what Jesus is saying, of course. But you need to realise that when Jesus is talking about water in John 4, he's not really talking about water. And when he's talking about salt in Matthew chapter 5, he's not really talking about salt. And when he talks about vines and vineyards, he's not really meaning that. And so when he talks about sheep and goats, actually he's not actually talking about sheep and goats. He's talking about people and people's reaction and response to God's command and God's love. Well, the Jews would have known, even if we don't realise that, the Jews would have known what Jesus was inferring when he was talking about sheep and goats. Here, the sheep are the Jews and their leaders, the leaders of the country. And he's setting a challenge to them, challenging them about what they've done and what they're doing. We often read about Jesus challenging the Pharisees, don't we? And drawing them up because of their hypocrisy. Yes, they were very religious. Yes, they were orthodox. They got all the right religious things to say. But unfortunately, their behaviour, their actions, their orthopraxy failed to show God's compassion. Don't forget parables like the Good Samaritan. What was it that happened there? The religious people showed no concern for the man who had been injured and left to die. So there's a real backstory here. When you start reading Matthew 25 and start reading about sheep, this isn't a new teaching. This isn't something that Jesus had just come up with after saying what he said in Matthew 24. There's a real backstory here. And whenever you read something in the New Testament, I think there's a fairly sure thing that if you go back and turn back through the Old Testament, you'll find a link there somewhere. If you read something in the New Testament, I guarantee it's mentioned in the Old Testament. And this was particularly true of what Jesus said. Jesus taught this, but he taught it in a new and different way, gave it a different emphasis and a different impact. Because what Jesus is saying here had been the message of the prophets down through the centuries. They'd continually been calling the leaders of their country to do something, to care for those in need, to ensure there's justice, to look after the outsiders. And you know how far back in the Old Testament you have to go to find it? All the way back in Leviticus. In Leviticus 19, verse 18, it tells, the instruction is there, the command is there for them to look after their neighbour, love your neighbour as yourself. And just over the few pages in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 to 20, it says this. For the Lord your God is a God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. So this teaching of Jesus is not new. And the reason that the Jews were instructed to do that back in Deuteronomy was because God himself had rescued them when they'd been strangers and homeless. He'd delivered them from slavery, and because of his goodness to them, they were to show kindness to others. That doesn't seem to be illustrated in the New Testament in the way some of the Jewish people behaved. Now, we have been saved by grace, the grace of God, and therefore we should be people of grace. We need to remember that. Back to the parable in Matthew 25. The scene is set, it's in heaven, and there's a great big throne, and in front of that throne are all the nations of the world gathered there. So it's an incredible sight. And there's a mixture of sheep and goats. Remember what I said about what Jesus meant? And Jesus separates the sheep from the goats and puts them on his right-hand side in a place of honour, and gives to them their heavenly inheritance. And the reason? They have fed him. They have given him something to drink. They welcomed him in when he was a stranger. They clothed him when he needed clothing. They cared for him when he was ill, and they visited when he was in prison. And the sheep are dumbfounded. They weren't aware when they did that. They'd obviously lived a kind life. They'd obviously done the right things. But they didn't realise that when they were doing these things to help people around them, they're actually doing it for Jesus. When thinking about this, I'm reminded of some words in Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, and it says, "Keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Continue to remember those in prison, as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated, as if you were suffering." This is what Jesus is calling us to do. This is what God wants us to do. Well, the Jews were judged for not being caring. Back in Ezekiel, he uses the same sort of picture. He talks about sheep, but of course he's not talking about sheep really. In chapter 34, he uses the picture of the sheep or the flock that he regards as being a picture of Israel. And some of the flock had become fat, while others were in need of care and food and had become thin and neglected. In Ezekiel's picture, the flock had been scattered. They were desperately in need of protection and food, but there was no one there to provide it for them. So God, in Ezekiel's prophecy, promises to become or to be their shepherd, to restore the flock, to bring them back from where they've been scattered. It's clear. God is judging the rulers and leaders of Israel for not doing what they should have been doing. But more importantly, I think for us it reveals something of the heart of God, God's compassion. And the theme in our Roots readings today is Jesus, King of Compassion. Sadly, there's no change. If we look back to Ezekiel in the 6th century BC and his criticism of the leaders and society then, I think we'll realise that there's very little change between now and then. The leaders had allowed injustice, exploitation and suffering, and there are many parts of the world where this word is still as relevant today as it was all those hundreds of years ago. And sadly, it may even, and probably is true, of our society here in the UK. Why is it that Marcus Rashford, a footballer, has to campaign for the needs of children, to make sure that the children have hot meals and there's meals for them in the holidays when they're not having the free school meal at school? We're one of the few richest countries in the world, and yet we have children who don't have enough to eat. And here, the rich get richer, often at the expense of the poorer people in society. So, This is quite a challenging chapter to read for us today, isn't it? We need to respond to this. We need to respond to the challenge to help the poor and campaign for change. This has been something of the Christian response down the centuries. The early church, for example, in the book of Acts were known for their because they were Christians by their love and their compassion for other people. They shared what they had and ensured that all had enough. John and Charles Wesley, who were involved in the start of the Methodist Church, when they were at university, they ran a holy club. And in that holy club, they got together and decided that one of the things they should do is visit people in prison, which was probably a very dangerous thing to do in the 18th century. But they showed their compassion for people by doing that. There's an organisation called Mateo 25, SoCal. I love the Americans with their abbreviations. It's named after Matthew 25, Mateo 25, Matthew 25, and SoCal, it means it's in Southern California. Here you've got people of faith who go out of their way to support and try and help immigrants and refugees, whilst the government of the USA has a hostile policy towards them. Then, of course, we know of people like Mother Teresa, who became famous, well known because of her work with the poorest people in India, inspired by our Christian faith. She talked about helping those people as ministering to Jesus in his many disguises. And then again, in the Roots materials, there's an illustration of a lady called Mary Glover, who ran a food project in the poorest parts of Washington, D.C., where they fed hundreds of people. And every morning before she opened the doors, she used to pray, "Lord, we know that you'll be coming through the door today, so help us treat you well. Help us treat the people as you would treat them." So, we need to prepare ourselves. We don't want to be caught out by the exam paper. We need to make sure we've prepared for the right exam and that we've done the right things and are able to give the answers that we need to. We don't want to think that we haven't been given the right information. So, like every good teacher, I would say, well, you need to listen to your teacher and always read the question properly before you try to answer them. And here, as I read these readings in preparation for today, I find that I'm challenged about how much and to what extent I have been prepared to reach out to those in need around me. We might encounter Jesus in many different ways in our community. I wonder, in this coming week, what situations will present us with an opportunity to serve Jesus? Now, I suppose I'd be happier if I'd got something deeply theological to present to you, perhaps a bit of one of Paul's epistles where he deals with some difficult concept. This doesn't seem a difficult concept at all. It seems very black and white. If we love Jesus, if we know that Jesus has saved us, if Jesus has given us a heart to serve him, then we need to know that one of the things he challenges us to do is to show his love to people around us. One of the song we're going to sing after the sermon is "When I Needed a Neighbour, Were You There, Were You There?" The second part of that first, if you like, part of the song, it says, "And the creed and the colour and the name don't matter, were you there?" It's hard. All sorts of people. We're going to come into contact with all sorts of people, some of whom we think might be exploiting our kindness. How do we know who is genuine? But let's prayerfully consider how we should be reaching out to people. Yes, we want to tell them the good news of the gospel. We want to tell them of the love of Jesus. But we might also have to start by helping them in their place of need. I'm not suggesting we need to be goody-goodies, but we need to behave in a way that reflects the compassion and love of God. God has a concern for the poor and the oppressed. Let's make a commitment to ensure there's a lasting legacy of Christian love and service in this town of Redditch and beyond. God bless. Bye.